Well, hello there, watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Joined tonight, as you can see, by Theo Usherwood and Pippa Crerar, with us from now until just before midnight. Welcome to both of you. Plenty to discuss, certainly, as well. Let's kick off with the Daily Mail as we look at tomorrow's front pages, reporting on Nigel Farage's intention to lead the Reform Party, calling it Rishi's darkest hour. The Guardian also reports on Nigel Farage's announcement coming as a major blow to the Conservatives. The Eye reports that his announcement is a surprise challenge for Rishi Sunak and could slim the Prime Minister's election hopes. Financial Times adding to that story, highlighting a new poll too that shows Labour could win the biggest majority of any party in this century. The Times also highlights the same poll, quotes Farage's speech saying that the Tories are on the verge of total collapse. A reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of those newspapers while you listen to our guests. So let's head straight to Theo and to Pippa. Goodness me, a real double blow. The polling carried out by YouGov, partnering with Sky News, and Nigel Farage throwing his hat in the ring and now leading Reform UK. Daily Mail summing it up, Pippa, Rishi's darkest hour.
Well, it is. In a campaign where Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives have been on the back foot for much of it, certainly looking like they're struggling to close the gap with the Labour Party as we get closer to the election, this is a particularly bad day. And we were all summoned to a press conference in central London by Reform UK earlier this afternoon. And the expectation was, lots of speculation about whether Nigel Farage would finally throw his hat in the ring. Obviously, he said as recently as last week that he had no plans to do that. But everywhere he went, he was getting the same question. How can you have the authority to, weigh in on the general election debate when you're not prepared to actually, go for it yourself and go for a seat? So he confirmed that not only was he going to take over from Richard Tice as leader of Reform UK, but also that he was going to stand in Clacton in Essex, which of course is the seat that UKIP, the predecessor party to Reform, stood and won in 2014 in a by-election. So there is a sort of a history of this party winning there. But it's a double blow for Sunak, isn't it? It's not just the fact that Nigel Farage will come in, will enliven the Reform campaign, will nibble away at votes on the right in lots of marginal seats, and potentially split the right-wing votes so that Labour comes through the middle in some of those seats, is also this poll result.
Yeah, absolutely. 4 p.m, Farage stuns Number 10 by revealing that he will lead Reform and stand as an MP. 5 p.m, bombshell poll showing Labour heading for its biggest election victory in its history. YouGov partnering with Sky News. Astonishing figures, actually, to be fair, and multiple lines coming out of this.
Yes, it's just worth going through those numbers. An astonishing poll, as you say. Anna, Labour, 422 seats, the Tories reduced to 140. That's the largest majority in its history for Keir Starmer. Now, if that poll runs true on polling day when people go to cast their ballots, it is slightly better than the MRP poll that was conducted at the end of last week, which put the Tories somewhere between 66 and 72 seats. But this is, of course, without news that Nigel Farage is standing now in this election. I think, firstly, the point that Pippa made is that everywhere he went, he was asked, why aren't you standing? And the argument, and it's a fair one, isn't it? If you're not standing in this election, why do you think that you can comment on it? Why do you think you can take part in the leaders' debates? Why do you think you could call a press conference?
His name was on the list for later this week, wasn't it?
And I think that's a valid point. And Farage, for all of his faults, he does have the ability to take a look at himself and actually say, that's a fair point. And he didn't have an adequate answer. And I think that's one of the reasons he threw his hat in the ring. The second one is that his career in America, if Donald Trump is elected president, is looking slightly more ropey now, given those verdicts in New York at the end of last week. It's before those verdicts, Trump was looking like not a surefire bet, but close to a surefire bet for the presidency in November. And right now, I think the project that is Donald Trump taking over from Joe Biden is not quite on such sure footing.
Yeah, I mean, there's two backstories that you're fascinated to know. One is the relationship with Donald Trump, and the other one is the Richard Tice standing aside part. You know, he said, didn't he, today, that I've got this this army of people who know me, and they know me better than Richard Tice. But did he just elbow him out the way, do you think?
Well, it was really interesting because he was asked a version of that question earlier, and there was this long pause. And Nigel Farage is not somebody who is generally lost for words, and he obviously was trying to work out how he could be diplomatic, but while standing right next to the guy that he had effectively elbowed aside. Not just that, but Tice has financially supported the party through loans to the tune of almost £1 million recently. So he's put his money where his mouth is. He's stood. He just is not, as charismatic or indeed as well-known figure as Nigel Farage, which was problematic for them. And there was a feeling that their heaviest hitter, their front man, was not fully involved in the campaign. What I think is really interesting, though, is he said that he would stand as leader. He'd stay as leader for 5 years. Now, do we actually believe that's going to happen if he doesn't win a seat?
Yeah.
We're also speaking to a lot of Conservative MPs this afternoon who are, already despondent and now feeling quite despairing, particularly if they're in seats which they could end up losing. But just to say as well, they already were feeling frustrated at Rishi Sunak's decision to hold an election this side of the summer rather than the autumn. They're doubly so now because there was, Theo mentioned the States, there was definitely the likelihood that if the two elections, the US and the UK, had been run in parallel,
Trump would have been out of the country.
Nigel Farage would have been over helping Donald Trump and not here causing trouble for Rishi Sunak.
There is just one word of caution. I just take you back to the 2015 election where Nigel Farage stood in Thanet. And he was so often down in Thanet campaigning to try and win the seat. And of course, this is his 8th go around. That actually,
he's 7 times been unsuccessful.
7 times unsuccessful. That if he gets lost in a campaign in Clacton, and Clacton's not very easy to get to unless you take a helicopter, but he could actually find himself dragged into Clacton campaigning because, of course, he daren't lose in Clacton and actually isn't able to hold the press conferences and take part front and centre in London where all the television cameras are. So I know everybody wants to see this as Farage taking command of the Reform UK and potentially causing problems for the Tories, but just logistically, he can't be in 2 places at once, and he daren't lose in Clacton.
Well, there's The Guardian as well. Tory alarmist Farage takes control of Reform UK. He's asked, is this going to be 8th time lucky? And he got a little bit, churlish about it, didn't he? Suggesting, I've only done it once for real. The others was a protest vote, and this is a revolt and all of that. One wonders that, he said he felt guilty that he was letting millions of people down. But do you think he just had FOMO? Is that what we're seeing?
I think probably in the same way we saw in I'm a Celebrity, he didn't want to miss out on any of the challenges, did he? I think probably seeing the political equivalent of that. He wants to be right in the fray, and this gives him the opportunity to be able to do so. And he'll be delighted that he's got the front pages on pretty much every paper we've seen so far anyway. He's got the splash. But I think it has to be seen in the context of this being bad news for the Conservatives and with his polls, obviously, as well. One Tory MP messaged us earlier, they're not MPs anymore, are they? But messaged us earlier to say that his return was an existential risk to the Conservative Party. And I think what is guaranteed, regardless of what the result in Clacton is that Nigel Farage is going to be standing on the sidelines as the Tory party, if they lose the election as expected, descends into more than introspection, into really a battle for the soul of the party going forward, and whether we end up seeing it lurching to the right post-election as they try to pitch to the voters that they've just lost to Reform.
Well, the interesting thing is who will be left to fight for that election. The suggestion that 12 cabinet ministers could be at risk if the polling, this YouGov poll, the double deal, double blow that's mentioned here, including people like Penny Mordaunt, for example, and Grant Shapps.
Who rang up Sam Coates live on air. And there was a very good moment. Sam was the devil putting him on speaker,
and the headlines from that poll, which are worth reflecting, it would be the most Labour seats in history, the worst Tory rout since 1906, a collapse of the SNP in Scotland, which would be another part of the Labour tail, and the Lib Dems quadrupling their seats as well. So the question is where the Tories go when they're being pincered, aren't they, by the Lib Dems in often Remain seats in the south, or around London, for example, and Reform as well, and then the Labour and the Red will collapse. So there's all these elements that are squeezing the Tories.
The pressure on Rishi Sunak is immense, and it's only increasing because all the while you've also got those Conservative MPs on the right of the party who face losing their seats, people like Jacob Rees-Mogg down in Somerset, and they're demanding things like cuts to taxes, abolishing any net zero targets, and that's something that Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt simply don't want to do. But they're pulling all the other levers in the hope that the polls or something is going to change in their fortunes, and it just continues to go badly for them. I really think that there's a very good chance that, if Nigel Farage gets into Parliament and he's sitting there as a Reform MP on the back benches. Now, the original, when I at the start of the campaign, I was having conversations with people in Reform, and they were talking to me about right-wing Conservatives suddenly coming over to their side where they could have 4 or 5, maybe a few more seats. But actually, would it be easier with Nigel Farage on the back benches as a Reform, maybe with somebody else, just to fold him into the Conservative Party, and the Conservative Party becomes much more right-wing with Farage in the fold? It's a fascinating thing, actually, because the election's happening on July the 4th, but it's going to be such an interesting summer to see which way the Conservative Party goes.
And that's definitely something which is being discussed both in Reform and in the Conservative Party. Despite what they say this side of an election, there would inevitably be pressure in that scenario Farage used to be a Conservative Party member, to bring him, some time ago, to bring him back into the fold. The problem with that is that it automatically ostracises the big chunk of the Conservative Party, and it still is probably the majority numerically. They regard themselves as being on the centre, the moderate, the One Nation wing of the party. Obviously, it depends who's left at the end of post-election, but electoral calculus suggests that actually you're going to see a decline in all different bits of the party. You're not suddenly going to see it lurching to the people that are left representing one wing or the other. So they would need to keep the One Nation wing involved. If they bring in Farage back to the Tory party, they're in danger of the other wing sort of separating out and potentially even splitting. And I think that MP that messaged us, that candidate that messaged us earlier to suggest that it was an existential crisis, the Conservative Party is spot on.
Yeah, and this is the great defence. Vote for Farage, you're more likely to end up with Starmer. Nigel Farage is saying exactly the same, that they're a goner anyway. The red wall's gone, so you might as well vote for us, because
exactly.
you ain't gonna save the Conservatives.
He's seen this line coming. It's the obvious line, isn't it, that we've seen time and time again, where the incumbent party says if you vote for somebody else, then you're going to end up with what you don't want, our foe being brought in de facto as a result. And this is, I think we're going to hear a lot more of this in the coming days from Rishi Sunak and fellow Tories saying, if you vote for Farage, then you're going to end up with Keir Starmer, and that's the last thing you want. So why don't you stick with the Conservatives? And I think it's the Express have got the interview, but I think this is going to be a drum that they're going to be banging hard between now and polling day.
It's interesting how the Express pitches that, shock U-turn at the top there, I will stand as an MP and get millions voting Reform. There's a sort of hint of support in that headline, isn't it, as the newspapers position themselves. The Eye is also leading on Farage blows apart Tory election plan with a surprise challenge to Sunak. Up the top, though, David Lammy, my nuclear conversion. Because the fascinating thing today was security, the push of national security by Sir Keir Starmer. Yeah. And yet many of those people had supported Jeremy Corbyn, who had suggested that he would never fire Britain's nuclear deterrent. So this is, it's been an interesting conversion for some, has it?
Yeah, and there's obviously David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, is one of those who previously voted against Trident Renewal, but so also did Angela Rayner, the Deputy Leader for the Labour Party, who said today that she still had the same position. She hadn't changed her position. Now, what her people say is that is not in any way trying to undermine Keir Starmer, who went on the broadcast round this morning or spoke to broadcasters this morning and insisted that his shadow cabinet was behind him on his plans. Instead, it was, her people say, a recognition that ultimately the vote that they had in Parliament was not about unilateral, it was not about multilateral disarmament. And if you ultimately want to get rid of nuclear weapons, it has to be something that's done internationally with collective agreement. And there's no sign of that happening. So actually, you can both say, in an ideal world, you want multilateral disarmament and you would like to live in a world without nuclear weapons, while at the same time recognising that that's not the situation here, and therefore you need to have a policy that retains Britain's nuclear deterrence. So, it's maybe a bit more nuanced than I think than it initially looked. But interesting again to hear Starmer talk about the latest, talk about security. He's talked about economic security, he's talked about border security, and now talking about sort of this defence aspect of this today, on the week, of course, that we have the D-Day anniversary, and that the military and defence issues are going to be right in the front line.
Absolutely, and indeed the first TV debates as well, with a lot to play for Rishi Sunak after the day he's had today. We've got plenty more still to come in the next part of our programme, including The Guardian reporting from Mexico, which has elected its first female president after a hugely violent campaign. Back in a moment.
Mexico, then.
Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me once again, Theo and Pippa. Welcome back to both of you. Theo, let's go to you and go to Mexico, which is in The Guardian, and this female leader with this horrendously violent campaign that the country has seen in a year of elections, obviously.
Yes, it's an extraordinary story, actually. It's the first president of a North American country, and she's Claudia Sheinbaum has won a historic victory, but it has been a campaign marred with violence. 37 candidates killed during the election campaign, and I've been just reading up on it. 150% increase in political violence since 2021. Of course, it'll be fascinating to see what happens in November with the Biden Republican candidate. I don't know whether it's going to be Donald Trump, but the relationship, of course, between Mexico and the US is critical. And this is she's also described as a left-wing climate scientist. So if Donald Trump becomes president, then it could be interesting bilateral meetings.
Yes, absolutely. I was intrigued that you thought it may not be Trump for a moment, actually, there, but there we go. But really fascinating that it's a female to emerge in a country that has femicide and drug cartels and this level of violence. It's very intriguing.
And the relationship with whoever ends up in the White House is crucial, not just because of the flows of people, which we've seen obviously being a major election issue, or major issue anyway, in the States with Donald Trump and his wall last time round. If he wins again, what then happens to that border? But also with law enforcement, because there's been huge flows of drugs, fentanyl in particular, over the border from Mexico. And the US law enforcement agencies would want to see stronger cooperation on that, whether, and so the relationship with Claudia Sheinbaum and her administration, I think, will come down to that relationship between law enforcement on the one hand, and then in terms of migrant flows on the other. But she was a continuity candidate as well, wasn't she? Her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known popularly as AMLO in Mexico, brought in a whole range of policies such as the minimum wage, cash transfers to elderly people and single parents, flagship infrastructure projects in historically poor areas. And with the aim of lifting, millions of people out of poverty, which obviously, was incredibly popular, but then also puts pressure on her when it comes to delivering.
OK, it's going to be fascinating how that all plays out. In the meantime, back to the UK, and shockingly, May was the warmest on record in the UK.
I don't
many
see how
people
that
have wanted
can
to
be.
put their heating on. It's been cold as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, Scotland's had it warm. Evenings have been warm, and its overall temperatures, which has led to hornets, an alert. People like me who've already carried a number out of their home. I'm getting quite adept at it, which is in the Times, actually. They've survived the winter, and this is the problem, isn't it? That warmer winters, Theo, will lead to... Oh, hang on, look, 10 seconds. Run out of time to talk about it. Haven't even got the right paper. Never mind, anyway. Theo Usherwood and Pippa Crerar, thank you both very much indeed. See